Link TV presents Mosaic World News from the Middle East. Here are today's top stories.
Thousands of Mauritanians declare readiness to kick out President Aziz. Devastating bombings hit the Syrian capital as the blame game continues. And Algeria holds parliamentary elections amid voter apathy. Mosaic, world news from the Middle East, begins now.
The Mauritanian opposition organized a festival in Nouakchott to demand the departure of President Mohamed Ould Abdelaziz's regime. The ruling party's deputy chairman, Omar Ould Ma'talla, said the people placed their trust in Ould Abdelaziz and the president is continuing the path of reforms and combating corruption.
Maybe the ruling party's time has come in Mauritania. It is probably the governing thread and the common denominator unifying these people who hold different views and varying political affiliations and ideologies. The leaders of the Opposition Coordination Committee took to the street again for a permitted march in anticipation of what they called the protest to force the departure.
The people of Nouakchott came out today to say one thing to Mohamed Ould Abdelaziz's regime: leave. Let the people of this country choose the kind of rule they deserve.
And during the festival, which ended here in one of the public squares, the opposition considered the turnout a new referendum on the legitimacy of the regime. The majority says the only way to topple the president is through the ballot box in about 2.5 years. The opposition responds with, "You see it as far, we see it as near." The former Mauritania president, Ali Mohamed Vall, who is one of the most prominent figures supporting this movement, escalated his tone against the regime again, describing it as a failure and finished.
We should hold prayers for the dead regime. God willing, this regime is very close to its end. The
Mauritanian opposition promised to engage in peaceful protests to force the current regime to leave. It also called on the military and security forces to, quote, side with the people and refrain from cracking down on them. On the other side, pro-government forces are intensifying their campaigns aimed at clarifying what they call the false allegations of a power-hungry opposition. The majority views the accomplishments of President Mohamed Ould Abdelaziz on the ground as ranging between right and void. Mohamed Abdallah El Mani, Al-Alam, Nouakchott.
The following program contains graphic scenes that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
The jasmines of Damascus are once again stained by the blood of the Damascenes. Blind terrorism struck employees, students, and workers. The scenes are difficult to watch, but we must broadcast these images as they are. Two terrorist bombings rocked the Qazzaz area in the southern part of the capital, as workers, students, and employees were heading to their schools, universities, and workplaces. Syria's Interior Ministry confirmed the two bombings were carried out by two suicide bombers driving two booby-trapped vehicles, carrying a large amount of explosive materials, estimated at over 1,000 kilograms. The blasts punched two craters in the ground. One is 5 meters long, 3 meters wide, and 1 meter deep. The other is approximately 8 meters long and 2 meters deep. This took place in the crowded area of Al-Qazzaz that is filled with cars and pedestrians and located near a law enforcement station. The preliminary figures of this terrorist attack is 55 martyrs and 372 injured civilians and soldiers. In addition, 15 unidentifiable bodies were found and great material damage was reported, which includes cars and private and public properties. Besides the remains of the victims, the images showed the widespread, massive destruction the two bombings caused. Rows of cars were burnt, houses were destroyed as rescue teams were working to tend to the wounded. Outside Damascus, columns of smoke were seen rising over the capital's sky. Meanwhile, the chief of the International Observers Delegation, Major General Robert Mood, visited the site of the two terrorist bombings and examined the situation on the ground, calling on everyone in and outside Syria to end the violence.
My deepest condolences, my warmest thoughts to all the families, to all the victims. My very clear message to anyone that is engaging in this kind of violence is that it is not going to solve any problems. So we need everyone inside Syria, everyone outside Syria, to understand that this is going to only create more suffering for women, children, the Syrian people.
And as usual, the two sides of the conflict traded accusations. The authorities blamed armed terrorist groups, while the Syrian National Council accused the regime of orchestrating the two bombings to show the observers that the country is in danger and to tell the international community that armed gangs and Al-Qaeda are taking root in Syria. As for the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, it confirmed that one of the two blasts seemed to have targeted the Palestine branch of the Military Intelligence Service, located near the bombing site. On the international front, UN envoy Kofi Annan condemned the two bombings, saying these disgraceful actions are unacceptable and that the violence in Syria must end. He said every act that leads the tension and level of violence to escalate will be counterproductive to the interests of all parties. Annan confirmed that his plan, which calls for ceasing the violence and starting a national political dialogue, is the country's final chance to avoid civil war. The Qatari Foreign Ministry denounced the two bombings and called on all parties in Syria to adhere to the Security Council's resolution to end the bloodshed in Syria. It stressed that Qatar rejects terrorism in all forms, regardless of its source. The European Union described the two bombings in Damascus as pure terrorist acts, affirming that Annan's plan is the best way to move the situation forward. Algerians continue to cast their votes in the parliamentary elections to choose members of the People's Assembly. Our correspondent there said the turnout reached 18% in the capital Algiers and 25% in other provinces. Algerian President Aziz urged Algerians to vote en masse to begin what he called a new phase of development, reforms and democratic growth.
Voters in Algeria are headed to the ballot box to cast their votes in parliamentary elections described as fateful by the authorities. Over 21 million people are registered to vote to elect 462 candidates affiliated with 44 political parties and a large number of independent candidates. However, the election campaign that looked weak did not attract much attention from many people.
I do not expect anything from politicians, and I don't care about this issue because everything is decided ahead of time. There is no politics.
Mobilizing the voters is the largest challenge facing the authorities and political parties, since a weak turnout will cause a political embarrassment.
Everyone should vote. We're waiting for change, and the matter is in our hands because nothing changes on its own.
Islamists from 7 parties are running in the elections. 3 of them are allied through the Green Algeria Alliance coalition. They confirm they will become the main political force in the elections, which came 1 year after Algerian President Abdelaziz Bouteflika announced political reforms in a bid to avoid an Arab Spring in his country. For the first time, 150 European observers are taking part in monitoring the elections, in addition to observers from the African Union, the Arab League, and the United Nations, raising the number of observers to 500. And even though Algeria is hanging a lot of hope on these elections, no one can predict their outcomes until the results are announced Friday morning, seeing that the scene remains ambiguous and lacks any indicators that one political family's control is under threat. Maha Sukkar, BBC.
Israeli occupation forces fired tear gas to disperse dozens of Palestinians who gathered in front of Ofer prison near Beitunia, west of Ramallah, to protest Israel's ongoing implementation of its administrative detention policy against Palestinian prisoners.
A number of the prisoners' relatives challenged employees at the International Red Cross in the city of Algeria and barred them from entering its headquarters to protest what they described as the negative position taken by the International Red Cross in regards to the case of prisoners on hunger strike.
This has become a daily scene at the gate of Ofer military prison, occupation soldiers armed to the teeth. And this time a bulldozer is brought to shut down the streets around the Beitunia commercial crossing, and 2 cars to spray foul-smelling wastewater mixed with chemicals at demonstrators. All this effort to repress a number of protesters standing in front of the gate in solidarity with the prisoners on hunger strike. Some of them joined the prisoners' relatives at the sit-in in front of the headquarters of the International Red Cross in the city of Algeria to protest what they described as the negative and biased role played by the international organization.
The Red Cross has to explain the case of our detainees inside the prisons. They've been unable to receive medical treatment, including some who are nearing death right now. Why is there this silence?
And in solidarity with the prisoners, hundreds of school students, including students at the school of Nabi Saleh, west of Ramallah, went on a hunger strike for hours to support a number of their schoolmates who are behind bars.
We are standing today in solidarity with the prisoners and our classmate Baha, who has been on a hunger strike in prison. They arrested him and he's missing school right now. We joined their hunger strike today to tell them that we support them no matter what.
As Ta'er Haletla and Bilal Diab continue their hunger strike for the 72nd consecutive day, their health has deteriorated. Like hundreds of other prisoners, they insist on continuing their strike until their demands are met, most notably the demand to put an end to solitary confinement.
Israel's prison service has confiscated all the prisoners' possessions and belongings and placed many of them in solitary confinement. It also transferred most of the hunger strikers from prison to prison with the goal of creating instability. But despite all these oppressive conditions, the prisoners are determined to achieve the goals of their hunger strike.
On the eve of the anniversary of the Palestinian Nakba, or catastrophe, the prisoners insist on continuing their battle until the end, even if it means death. And for those on the outside, they confirm this Nakba has not yet ended in light of Israel's continuing violations of all human rights, not to mention political and international rights. Jivar Al-Buderi, Al Jazeera, from in front of Ofer military prison, west of occupied Ramallah.
Bahrain has postponed the retrial of some 20 medical professionals accused of giving medical care to protesters injured during crackdowns on anti-regime protests last year. The doctors and nurses have been sentenced to up to 15 years in prison by a military tribunal. This is the second time the court is delaying the proceedings. A retrial is also underway for a group of 21 activists, including a prominent rights defender who's been on a hunger strike for 3 months.
Bahraini protesters have once again staged rallies in support of the country's political prisoners. This time they took to the streets of Dar Qalab and Sanabes villages. The protesters in Shahrakan and Karzakan villages hit the streets in the early hours of the morning. They burned tires and blocked roads to protest the recent arrest of women activists. Anti-monarchy protests have continued almost on a daily basis in defiance of the Saudi-backed crackdown on protests. More than 80 anti-regime protesters have lost their lives at the hand of regime forces since last year. But despite blatant human rights violations and condemnation by the rights groups, the international community remains indifferent to the situation in Bahrain. The West, in particular, seems to be looking for its best interest when it comes to supporting the different revolutions in the region. Let's take the U.S. stance on the Egyptian revolution.
And we urge that all parties exercise restraint and refrain from violence. But our assessment is that the Egyptian government is stable.
Now compare that with its position on the uprising in Bahrain.
So our advice to all sides is that they must take steps now to negotiate toward a political resolution.
It may be relevant to point out that Bahrain is home to America's Fifth Fleet, and Egypt was one Arab nation with close relations with Israel under Mubarak's 30-year-old dictatorial reign. Washington has always supported authoritarian regimes, regardless of their human rights records or their oppressive policies. The same stands true about ties between Riyadh and Washington. The Obama administration has failed to even acknowledge any uprisings in Saudi Arabia, despite the kingdom's long record of human rights violations and crackdowns on anti-regime protests, especially in the oil-rich eastern province. Now, where does the U.S. stand when it comes to the Syrian unrest?
There will be increasingly capable opposition forces. They will, from somewhere, somehow, find the means to defend themselves as well as begin offensive measures.
U.S. regional allies, however, say they don't mind militarizing the conflict in Syria in the hopes of getting rid of President Bashar al-Assad. Washington's foreign policy towards different conflicts in the Middle East represents a clear double standard. The Obama administration supports regime change in some cases, but rejects popular uprisings in others. Apparently, what's good for Syria doesn't work for Bahrain or Saudi Arabia.
Egypt's Electoral Commission has reportedly decided not to ban former Prime Minister Ahmed Shafiq from the presidential race. This comes despite the administrative court's attempt to reinstate a law that would ban ministers from Hosni Mubarak's era from running in the elections. Shafiq had been disqualified from Egypt's presidential elections in late April. His disqualification came after the disenfranchisement law was passed by Parliament and approved by the ruling military council. Egyptians will go to the polls later this month to elect a new head of state. It will be the country's first presidential race since the fall of the Mubarak regime in February last year. Staying with Egypt, the Higher Presidential Elections Commission has called for the immediate resumption of its suspended activities, but all prominent presidential candidates have rejected any attempt to delay the election. This report inspects what could be described as a judicial mess prior to the country's long-awaited first presidential election in the post-revolution period. Here's more from Cairo.
Egypt's leading presidential figures have rejected any attempt to delay the eagerly awaited presidential elections after calling for the immediate resumption of suspended activities by the Higher Presidential Elections Commission, the HPEC. Leading candidates Amr Moussa, Abdul Mun'im Abul Futuh and Mohammed Morsi all warned about the repercussions of what they described as a harmful decision that could drag the country into chaos.
I believe that it's irresponsible move from the side of the Electoral Presidential Election Committee. I believe that there's no time and there's no space for such maneuvers. I believe that we are in a very sensitive juncture in Egypt, that we cannot afford such games.
The HPEC had frozen its activities in protest at what it perceived as interference by parliaments, which recently approved amendments on presidential election laws, asking the ruling military council in Egypt for intervention.
The thing that they are protesting shouldn't be protested at in the first place. It is the people's simply right, the parliament right, to make such amendments on the law.
Powers granted to the HPEC by the military council were perceived as limitless, something that angered parliaments and all political powers and raised observers' fears in Egypt that the upcoming presidential elections could witness rigging. And now the big fear is a potential delay in the elections.
One of the judges of HPEC, but he didn't want to mention his name, he said to me, this procedure will maybe cause to delay or to postpone the election 2 weeks at least.
Experts say a delay is totally out of the question, despite an ever so cloudy picture.
Elections in Egypt cannot be postponed, nor politically, nor judicially.
The fact that the ball is in the military council's courts and that it is the only side that can call on voters to go to the polls is the only thing experts agreed about.
And that specific coal is the only thing that can keep traffic flowing in Cairo's iconic Tahrir Square, the scene of million-man marches. Mohammed Chalabi, Press TV, Cairo.
News of the political deal between Netanyahu and Mofaz brought hundreds of protesters to the streets last night. Demonstrators gathered at separate rallies in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Beersheba, where they demanded a more ethical system of government. Several leading political figures participated in the Tel Aviv protest, including former opposition leader Tzipi Livni, who told the crowd that they deserve politics of principles and not Knesset seats. 3 people, including 2 journalists, were arrested at the Tel Aviv protest, which police say was held without a permit. The event was organized by leaders of the social protest movement who headed last year's mass demonstrations. Additional large-scale protests are scheduled for this coming Saturday night. And in other news, Moody's international credit rating agency put a damper on the moods of the nation's financial institutions as the ratings of Israel's banking system were lowered from stable to negative. According to Moody's, the move comes in part due to the bank's heavy exposure to a small group of large business concerns. The agency also took into account Israel's security outlook, explaining that increasing geopolitical tensions could compromise business confidence and economic activity. There was one ray of hope in the report, however, as Moody's offered praise for Israel's resilience, finding that the economy is able to withstand repeated shocks. Bank of Israel officials say that they intend to study the report before responding.
Jewish settlers burned hundreds of trees in the villages of Bahrain and Jamain in Nablus province with the goal of seizing more land from the Palestinians.
These trees were burnt by settlers here in the town of Jamain in southern Nablus. It is an expression of their deep hatred for the Palestinian land and people. Over 100 trees were burnt in this area, located 3 kilometers southeast of the town of Jamain. The area between the town and the 2 settlements of Ariel and Tafua has witnessed torching operations targeting fruit trees. The 2 settlements have seized vast areas of Palestinian villages in this region.
The settlers are part of the occupation, and as usual, they burn trees and cut down olive trees to clear the land and completely seize it.
Olive trees were planted on these vast areas. The landowners live with the hope of profiting from the fruits during the yearly olive harvest season. But the settlers' targeting of Palestinian land disrupts the lives of these citizens.
These are all oppressive measures. These oppressive measures are used to clear the land of its residents and destroy the livelihood of its citizens.
No day or night is devoid of aggressions against the Palestinian farmers by the settlers or occupation soldiers. They have developed a systematic plan that is overseen by the Israeli government to clear Palestinian land of its owners, who are trying by any means to protect their land from the settlers' invasion.
What happened today in the towns of Jamain and Bahrain, where dozens of trees were cut down, comes as part of a ruthless campaign led by the Israeli government to impose a new reality on the ground. And of course, as a response, we are reforming and reactivating the watchdog committees with the cooperation of village councils in all residential areas.
So it is a policy carried out by the settlers under the supervision of the Israeli government. They aim to seize large areas of the citizens' lands across most Palestinian villages, which are targeted by the settlers to tighten the noose on the Palestinian people. The crimes of the occupiers and their settlers have no limits. What happened here is evidence of the settlers' practices and their attempt to completely expel the Palestinians from their land for rejecting these measures. From the town of Jamain, Khalil Abu Arab, Palestine TV.
For the third consecutive time, the occupation's bulldozers demolished 3 commercial stores in Bethlehem. In addition, the occupation seized equipment from an auto parts shop in the industrial district in the village of Husan.
Without a warning, I received a phone call this morning from some youths in Husan informing me that my store was demolished by Israelis at 4 a.m. They demolished it with the equipment inside.
We were caught off guard when Israeli forces stormed the village at 4 in the morning and demolished some retail stores, as you saw. This is not the first time. In fact, this is the 4th or 5th consecutive time the Israelis have raided this area under the pretext that it is part of Area C. The aim is to squeeze the residents and the shop owners who are trying to secure the children's daily food needs.
The views expressed on Mosaic are from contributing broadcasters, not Link TV or its sponsors. The production of Mosaic is made possible by grants from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Wincoat Foundation, the Firedoll Foundation, and by support of viewers like you. Thank you. Watch Mosaic World News online. Stay up to date with breaking news, read our blog, get transcripts of past shows, and more at linktv.org/mosaic. Airwaves, a global channel of uncompromising stories, world news, documentaries, entertainment, and culture. Link TV, connecting you to the world. For more information, visit linktv.org.